I was watching a conversation between Paul Kagame and Mbisa, and to quote Paul Kagame, he said that any African country that relies heavily on foreign aid has not gone through a genocide. And his argument was...
Okay. I'm curious.
And his argument was that any country that is relying on another foreigner who can wake up and go and leave you at your worst is preparing for what he called a time bomb. Aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of governments in Africa. And that's because, by and large, most of the governments in Africa today are predominantly surviving on aid. I think Yusuf, my good friend, a very great thinker, by the way, I must say, has written some good arguments around that. But also, Joseph, when we are to put these things in just small terms, when you look at the corrosive nature of aid today, it doesn't really put these leaders in a position where they feel accountable.
This is the Policy Digest, a Center for Policy Analysis podcast that explores how African societies are governed and how people and their leaders are shaping the future of their communities. Through candid conversations and insightful analysis, we aim to provide a deeper understanding of the political, economic, and social landscape of Africa. So sit back, relax, and get ready to explore the diverse and dynamic world of African governance.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, we all know that there was a shortage of medical supplies all around the world, but some regions had more medical supplies. On one shipment, which was coming from China, where the COVID-19 pandemic had emerged from, when you would see the shipping containers, there was a quote which was written on the containers, which was that we are all waves from the same sea. And those containers were going everywhere. The idea is that normally in instances where there is abundance in one area and there's a shortage in another area, then those who have more carry either a moral obligation because of the situation they are in, or because they have contributed to the problem. They contribute to solving those problems. And that, since the 1950s, after the World War I, with the Marshall Plan, with restructuring of the governance structures of the African societies, with the structured adjustment programs in the 1980s and in the 2000s, that created a special instrument of constructing society from the ruins it is in, and that instrument is called foreign aid. Now, foreign aid is a foreign policy instrument that is used by governments to advance their geopolitical, economic, and humanitarian objectives. And in this very specific podcast, we're going to look at the effectiveness of this foreign policy instrument, which is foreign aid. And in order to do so, we're joined by a governance and fundraising expert who is closely associated with Action Aid International and YouLead Africa. Reagan Mwebaze, you are most welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joseph, for having me.
It's our honor to have you. And maybe just to guide us, when did you pick an interest in aspects to do with fundraising and philanthropy?
I think I think there is quite a lot of work that is done by civil society, especially in matters regarding development. Matters by development, I mean poverty alleviation and so on. So in a situation where we are having absence of government in quite very many places, especially in the context of Africa, civil society really plays a very key role. But for me, fundraising is particularly an area of interest, largely because we cannot do much unless we get the funds. So that's what really drives my interest.
When in your life do you say, I'm going to focus on raising resources for causes which are going to fill the gaps where government has failed?
I think social justice has always been my thing. I think right from as early as senior 5, I think I was always so passionate about social justice. You and I go way back, and I think you remember the conversations that we even used to have in our early years. Matters pertaining social justice, really, seeing communities transform, seeing people's lives change for the better. So, of course, after then joining in and realizing the different, of course, civil society is quite broad. We have very many different elements. One could have maybe joined M&E, one could have, settled for just programming. But for me, fundraising became personal because at the end of the day, it is the fulcrum of our work. You must raise funds, you must raise resources, but also I'm particularly Pan-African, So I believe that unless we pay keen attention to how we fundraise, then we can find ourselves in what people might call neocolonialism. And that's why specifically I believe that for you to fundraise in Africa today, you must be so cautious and so keen, but also be as a Pan-African cadre as much as you can.
Maybe just to follow up on that, recently in Uganda, when the foreign agent narrative was being used against activists, the idea was once you are opposing the state, then you are labeled as a foreign agent. One of the conversations, mostly from the state, was that it's foreign multilateral funds, like you said, like Danida previously, the closed down democratic governance facility, that you are an agent of a foreign government that is trying to literally, you're like a hired hand, you're a mercenary, only that you don't have a gun, probably have a phone and a Twitter account or whatever you're using as a modulus for activists. So you seem to suggest that there's a link between foreign aid and neocolonialism. Could you try and maybe shed more light about that?
Well, in some instances there is. In some senses, and I will explain why. But specifically to the context in which our Ugandan government today tends to play that card, it's just a double standard. It's in denial of the realities of the day. The questions these activists are raising are very pertinent questions. They are questions that we live and stay in each and every day. I think the government of Uganda really needs to stop playing this double standard because, to begin with, the funding that comes to the government, and perhaps I will speak about that later as we go in the discussion, the funding that comes to the government, largely most of it is foreign. So if, for example...
Oh yes, the government raises, let's say, about 35 trillion every year.
Yeah.
About 32 of that gets to loan repayment. So
if, for example...
Where do they get the other 72
exactly.
Balanced? That's about 37 remaining.
By the way, I do not find any problem with whichever foreigner funding government and funding civil society or activists to hold government accountable. It's
in their interest.
Yeah, it's in their
right?
interest.
Because they're giving government money to work.
Yeah,
which they do. So budget support.
Bring it at an organization level. That you have accountants, but then you again once in a while bring in external auditors to audit your processes. There is nothing wrong with that. Though, the biggest...
You make an argument which I think we need to expand on before we proceed, which is that, let's say best case scenario, these people are hired hands, right? Hired hands who are trying to hold the government to account. It's still in their interest to do so because they have given you money and they want it effective. And probably they're not on ground. So they ferment accountability from civil society. They win, you also win.
In other places, and I think I was having a conversation last year in Nairobi, and I was asked about what then, if not for, how then can donors support the processes, especially as we move to a more sustainable approach when it comes to aid, And I was saying, look, for me, the role of how I see as transition is that donors can also play a role by supporting government reforms. But how do you support government reforms? You empower civil society actors and you empower them, or you tie that aid towards creating
creating
reforms
room for civil society.
Around accountability. You have to strengthen the accountability arm. So if the donors, if the foreigners, to quote the government as it normally puts them, the foreigners are supporting activists to demand for accountability that is just and within their rights, I do not find any problem with that.
Yeah, I totally get you, because I know there could be ways through which institutions can be funded. I think there was a USAID project that one of the NGOs I know we are part of, the GAP program, it ended. I know there's a way you can support civil society to strengthen their not civil society, governments to have to strengthen their accountability mechanisms. But broadly, accountability it has a lot to do with like an external actor. Yeah, you being able to answer for your actions, but also being able to answer for your inactions. Maybe that aside, so the question we're indulging is how do we assess the effectiveness of aid, right? So if we had like to set metrics on how we determine whether aid is effective, how would those metrics or standards for like evaluating the effectiveness of the foreign policy instrument used by other nations called foreign aid, how would we set those specific metrics?
Joseph, to begin with, I want to first remind us and also our viewers that there are different types of aid. There is the charitable aid, that is the NGO aid. There is what we call humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is where, for example, if we have, say, a landslide, if we have
refugees,
that kind of aid where now we get, people and people are contributing their money towards
emergencies.
Towards emergencies, So that is like a moral imperative really of society. It's something we do out of being human, So that's not the aid that I'm going to address. The aid that I'm going to address is what we call government-to-government bilateral aid, where government A in Europe there gives government B in Africa today money to, and normally it is through the breasthold institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, money for infrastructure development, money towards quite very many interventions. So that is the aid that I'm going to really speak to. One, I want to believe that the best way the best way of verifying whether it is as effective as should be is looking at the results. You will remember that the Marshall Plan that you talked about, which was mostly like the Europe Recovery Plan, was an initiative by the US after the World War to rebuild Europe, And by and large, very many scholars have argued that it was a success.
Oh, yeah.
I think there are some reservations here and there, but I think it was a success. But now go back to post-colonial Africa when aid became so famous and tell me today, has it been a success really? Has Africa moved towards being as sustainable?
It's quite a good contrast because Europe received aid.
Yeah.
It's no longer receiving aid. For us, we're receiving aid.
And it's now the new normal today.
We don't look like we have a plan, right?
Yeah. So
out of aid, sure.
I think to answer your question, really, that contrast, like you have seen, shows you the gap. And the gap is so wide.
And I don't know, you've read Yusuf Sarun Kumar's classic, The Snake Farmers, right?
Yeah.
Which speaks of the infrastructure of aid being constructed in such a way, of course, quite a lot of satire there, in such a way that the problem, like people don't want to fix the problem. They just want to keep an industry where that problem is fixed perpetually because there's some form of benefit on the tail end. But maybe that's just one of the reasons. If we are to just interrogate, why is it that there doesn't look like a future without aid for African countries that are having to live on the lifeline of foreign aid?
One, I think aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of governments in Africa. And that's because, by and large, most of the governments in Africa today are predominantly surviving on aid. I think Yusuf, my good friend, a very great thinker, by the way, I must say, has written some good arguments around that. But also, Joseph, when we are to put these things in just small terms, when you look at the corrosive nature of aid today, it doesn't really put these leaders in a position where they feel accountable to the people, So, for example, when you look at countries that are self-sustaining, they know that it begins with the voters. So the voters have the power to both vote you in and vote you out, because largely everything is by the voters. So come back to our context here today, come back to Africa here today, that today in Africa, a leader is more accountable to a donor than they are accountable to the people. That's not a good position to be in,
And maybe just interrogate that accountability. Recently, Ashburn.
Mm-hmm.
So Ashburn, he made a post on LinkedIn which says that there's a double standard with local organizations who have accountability issues being punished so harshly, but if the international aid organization has a problem with accountability, they're not like, no one cares. No one even questions whether they are having accountability issues.
Mm-hmm.
There's an assumption that there is goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
Does that accountability system exist? Or because they have given you aid, maybe you have traded off either your independence, now they are your patron, there's some sort of patronage relationship. Does accountability even exist for these specific resources?
So I will take you to, I will take you back in the early 90s. There was a convention called the Paris Agenda. It's commonly known as the Paris Agenda. And it was a conference that was discussing actually the effectiveness of aid. It was held in Paris. And the conversation was around some of the key outcomes in that conversation was that Africa also takes part and in as far as one defining what their priority targets are, what their interventions should be, because they understand their solutions better. And there is this whole subtle impression that I sometimes don't get, that we Africans don't really understand what our problems are sometimes. And so when you look at the Paris Agenda, the long and short from that agenda was that Africa is treated as a partner in development, That way, we would then have a situation where they are accountable to us, the foreigners are accountable to us, and then we are also accountable to them. Where did that go? I don't know. So we cannot really delude ourselves that we are in a position where they are accountable to us, because I think largely what the Paris Agenda was looking at was also Africa positioning itself in the long run as a potential key player, so that then you come to the table with also something you're giving back.
Very, very hard, Reagan.
Otherwise,
walk me through the thought experiment. Someone is giving you money, right? You are the partner. What are you putting on the table?
So how that would work is...
the power balance is just
killed. So how that work, I think what they had envisioned, and I'm just thinking, I think what they had envisioned was that eventually Africa was going to grow. I think they had not envisioned that the system they had designed, the model they had designed was going to be donor recipient forever. I think like we were talking about with the Marshall Plan, it was also looking at, okay, so what happens after this? If Africa now becomes strong, then now you have a situation where you approach Africa as a partner. Joseph, I will give you an example that today China is in Africa, but China is in Africa as a partner. They're here for business. We have a product, they have a service. They have a service, we have a product.
We have a market, they have a product.
We have a market, they have a product. They have their markets, we have some products which they
have money, we need the money.
Exactly. So that model, I think, is something that they had also envisioned that could happen at a particular time. However, years later, Africa is still in a position where the model has remained donor-recipient.
Yeah, and I think that's bad. I think the former president of Ghana had the one who did he lose the election? I don't know. The idea is he's no longer president. He was asking himself, when will we stop receiving aid? Like, when will we also as a country start to give aid to other countries, right? When do we get to a point where as African countries, we build resilience that enables us to raise enough domestic revenue or enable us to get enough money either from our state institutions or from the ingenuity or the genius of our people and raise enough resources. And maybe that also like really takes us to the question, how can we map out a future where these donors are not simply giving us projects, implement this without respecting local context? How do we localize philanthropy such that it drives more effectiveness, such that there's like effectiveness per foreign aid dollar?
I think it would take methodical madness from our leadership. By methodical madness, I mean it would require a leader who is unconventional, and it has been done. Just in the neighborhood in Tanzania, John Pombe Magufuli was collecting revenue locally. That's the revenue largely that built most of the roads. That's the revenue that largely made a big contribution to the rail line that was recently launched. So it has been done. But also, Joseph, remember in one of the conversations, I was watching a conversation between Paul Kagame and Dambisa. And to quote Paul Kagame, he said that any African country that relies heavily on foreign aid has not gone through a genocide. And his argument was...
okay.
And
I'm curious.
And his argument was that any country that is relying on another foreigner who can wake up and go and leave you at your worst is preparing for what he called a time bomb, And he then created an analysis of how the foreigners, the donors left them at the time when Rwanda needed them the most. And it was making a lot of sense. So for me, it comes back to the question of leadership. What kind of leadership do we have? If we had a leadership, Joseph, that would, one, bring back a system where, to begin with, we get back to the locals. How do we improve our local governance structures, to improve our accountability, to improve our governance systems at the local level? How do we localize? And by localize, I mean, how do we give the people the capacity to come up with solutions? But also, most importantly, how do we support our SMEs? These are the biggest consumers of young people. And the more you support, you have an economic empowered young population, the more the jobs that you're creating. Therefore, you don't need to over-rely.
You have, sure.
Yeah, but also the dark reality of aid today is that it is the biggest and most open and most basic and misused source of funding for any African government. So unless, again, That's why I started with it takes methodical madness. It takes leaders like Kagame, leaders like Magufuli, who will stand their ground and say, no, this is not the way. We are taking this way.
Well, maybe just to take us through, what exactly did John Pombe, rest in peace, do? Did he stop the tap from flowing to Tanzania and said we're going to use our own resources? Kagame, I'm not sure. He's quite liberal.
Yeah, Kagame is quite liberal, but for example...
But I think there's aid he said he's not coming to the country, by the way.
Yeah, but also I will give you an example. You go to, and in another space, we are having a discussion with a friend of mine, and I told him that when you find a country that has a booming civil society, just know you have problems. It's a sign... It's a sign of problems because we
they're going to manufacture problems.
No, because we survive. Civil society survives largely on problems, and you know that. However, when it comes to Rwanda, for example, Rwanda doesn't have as many NGOs. It doesn't.
They have NGOs in renewable energy, in agricultural transformation.
But also look at the loans Rwanda gets. Look at the conditions. Look at the way they condition their loans. They're not as bad as we have here in my good country, Uganda. What Magufuli did was, you remember there was a time, for example, I will just break it down a bit. First of all, Magufuli refused to travel to any country and said we have ambassadors. How much resources was he saving? Magufuli said no. We can cut down this cabinet and reduce the government expenditure and invest this money to roads, to infrastructure. You know, that is in other governments. That is money that is borrowed mostly. What do we borrow on most? Most of them are infrastructure. Most of the loans that we have from these Bretton Woods institutions, they're infrastructure loans, you know. And let's also come to the other bit about Magufuli. You remember that he used to give tough conditions for the loans. There is a time he refused a loan from China and said, no, you will work on our terms. You know?
He had guts.
He had guts.
Hey.
And I think those guts were informed by, we can do this ourselves if they refuse. You know?
Yeah, not to see them as desperate. And I think, Reagan,
see them as desperate.
We're going to still proceed in the second segment of the podcast to dig into the African mind and how it has been impaired by the idea that they cannot live without a foreign penny, that they cannot sustain themselves, and they have to live off the sweat of British citizens or American citizens or Chinese citizens. Let's come to that in the second segment of the podcast.
Welcome to the Parliament Performance Tracker platform, a portal designed to empower Ugandan citizens with valuable insights into their parliament's performance and financial landscape. Some of the key highlights of this platform include the Parliament Legislators Report Card. Here, you find comprehensive information on the members of the Ugandan Parliament, from contact details and their biographies to their legislative performance, including bills sponsored, bill participation, term count, and the number of parliamentary committees they sit on. This section provides a transparent view on each legislator's contributions and activities. The Finance Tracker. This consists of two powerful tools: the Budget Tracker and the Debt Tracker. The Budget Tracker displays the current budget allocations of Uganda, allowing you to track how public resources are distributed across various sectors. But that's not all. There is also the Budget Simulator tool, enabling you to actively participate in the budgeting process by simulating your preferred resource allocations. While the Debt Tracker provides insights into Uganda's national debt standing, you will discover key metrics such as the debt per citizen, GDP per capita, and per capita income, along with the sources of these loans. Stay informed about Uganda's financial health and the implications for future generations. Insights. This is a platform where you can gain valuable knowledge about parliament-related topics. Simply enter your queries and our system system will fetch relevant articles and also provide AI-generated summaries, offering you a deeper understanding of the issues that matter to you. With its comprehensive tools, staying informed about Uganda's parliament and financial landscape has never been easier. Whether you're curious about your representative's performance, want to understand their budget allocations, or seek insights on parliament-related topics, this platform has you covered. Empower yourself with data and take an active role in shaping Uganda's future. Parliament Watch. Your eye on Parliament.
So we all know that leaders are a fundamental reflection of the values of a community. And given that the African community has remained a community that is perpetually recipient to aid without any clear work plan on how they're going to emerge from being helped, it speaks to a fundamental value system that has a problem where people do not question the idea that they should perpetually remain in a situation where they are a receiver of aid. But maybe if you are able to walk us through how can we decolonize aid in such a way that it is delivered, because I think we still need it, but it does not endanger our psyche to know that we can live as a society without aid, that time can come.
Yes, so to begin with, I think, again, it would take methodical madness. I'll give you an example, Joseph, that some of the bodies that we have today that are continental Pan-African bodies, for example, the African Development Bank, that was primarily, we thought with the emergence of the African Development Bank, we wouldn't be having all these African countries having the kind of loans they have with IMF and with the World Bank. We had thought that at least Africa was now moving towards a position of we can borrow from the African Development Bank at an agreeable interest, even if the interest is high. At the end of the day, if it is your own institution, then you know that one way or the other, the money will come back to Africa. But Joseph, you will be interested to know that African Development Bank has 81 shareholders, and the second largest is the United States of America. Exactly. So that moment of silence in there goes a long way to show you how much, how bad of a state we still are in. You will also realize that, for example, most of the work, let it be African Union, let it be East African Community, it is foreign funded. And someone might be out there and asking themselves, why is he, insisting on the foreign funding? But look, when you remember back in the Cold War dynamics, when aid in Africa became, very, very popular, it was largely because the Soviet Union at the time and the United States were all trying as much as they can to increase their presence and interest in Africa. So that's aid, yes, used to come, of course, in the name of poverty alleviation and all the whatnots. But it had political and global geopolitics interest attached on it. The question is, has that position changed today? That's the question I want to leave with our people. Has that position changed today? Are we really sure? Another example, recently in Uganda, maybe to bring it back home, in Uganda, when the anti-homosexuality bill was passed, you could see the tension that was running around. Okay, now what is going to happen to our AIDS money, the money that we have been largely, our AIDS work has been largely funded by the United States. What if they pull that money back? What if there were a lot of conjunctives, what ifs, and that should have been a point for us to come back as a country and reflect and say, look, is this the position that we forever want to be in? That now, even if, and I'm not saying that I am for or against that bill, but I'm just using it as an example to show you how much you then lose your independence, because you cannot even now make a decision.
Just take care of your health bills.
Yeah, exactly.
I was researching about the research that is catalyzing the need for a national health insurance bill. you realize that more than 45% of the health budget, Minister of Health, that's really putting medicine on the table, putting medical supplies, is funded by USAID.
Joseph, on that note, one of the things that aid has largely done bad for Africa is that it has placed the leaders in a position where they no longer give us the basic public goods. What are the basic public goods? Economists normally argue that basic public goods are goods that are given to society for free. You know, you go to Canada, you go to most of these countries, you realize education is for free. Medical health is for free. You know, good public transport is for free in some countries. And come back, that is the basic element in which we are supposed to be able to weigh our leadership and say, okay, hospitals, do we have hospitals? What is the state of our hospitals? Do we have access to good quality free education? Okay? But because aid has taken over these, you know, you will find that largely your health budget is aid. Your education budget is aid.
Almost all public
all public goods are right now funded by aid. The question is, where is our leadership? Where are our leaders? That is one thing that I totally agree on when some people argue that, you know, it all starts with leadership. I totally agree. It all starts with leadership. And that's why I continue to say that it will take methodical madness. Someone who will come and just change this narrative, because it has been done before and it can be done. But also you look at the question of our psyche and our mental is largely because that's what we have seen. You know, why I'm calling it methodical madness is because it will take someone out of this conventional thinking of doing things to say, look, we are going a different path. It will come at a cost, yes, but we are taking a different path. So primarily, our people have been put in this position because it is the day. It is the day-to-day, you know. It is, I mean, Joseph, you affiliate, you are closely working with charitable organizations. I am working with NGOs. And here we are having this tough discussion that could even be career limiting. So it takes that kind of methodical madness to come out and say, okay, yes, we agree, this is the system, this is what we have found, but what are we doing about it?
Disruption.
Yeah. What are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? Yeah.
And I think that's quite a fundamental question around conditionalities that either the Bretton Woods institutions or other institutions bring forth as they advance foreign aid in whichever form it comes, as a foreign policy instrument, but also as a tool of soft power, of softening the ground before you land. Maybe if we were to fold into the conversation on the link between foreign aid and authoritarianism, as was noted by Tobias Hagman and Philip, but also I think Dambisa Moyo has that argument in her book, Dead Aid, where she contends that aid perpetuates bad governance systems rather than enable good governance. Would you like to link us in that direction?
So to begin with, most of the regimes, and I say this without any fear of contradiction, most of the regimes in Africa today are dystopian regimes. They are non-existent on the ground. And I would largely link it to aid. You see, there is this subtle impression that for as long as one, I think it's he who calls the piper, calls the tune, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Who pays the piper determines the tune.
But at least I know in Ruchiga we have something like the hand that you cannot cut the hand that feeds you. You know. So what normally happens is, for example, when you look at Central African, let's just look at Central African Republic today, that the current regime that is there, that is really lacking in most of it's only one would say it's only alive in the city, the president is being guarded by Russians. The Russians, for example, go as low as sponsoring the Miss Central Africa Republic event. They have now started learning Russian, so whenever they are...
It's about to be a national language.
Exactly. But remember, they are moving away from the initial, which was the French. So there was a time when the French were the biggest, because that part of the country largely was always French, and now Russia is also trying to create its presence there. So what does that show you? That shows you that this aid that normally comes has its own interests that are deeply rooted sometimes. So to get back to your question of how do we localize aid, I think first of all we need to come back and say, as our government, can we invest and have market-based solutions? Can we invest in our local young people? Because the beauty with investing in your local people, then you have solutions that are on ground. I understand better the solutions the problems in my community. Therefore, I understand the solutions better. And also, that's where we are moving a lot regarding localization right now, the localization agenda. That communities are in a position of understanding their problems better, and therefore they also understand their solutions better. But also, I think we need to try as much as we can. Our governments need to try as much as they can to create an economic friendly environment. Because the beauty with that then is that you have a big business sector. Now, the other beauty with having a big business sector is that you will then have cooperatives which are largely moving and have that role to play through their corporate social responsibility coming down to the communities. And that's how communities get transformed. But also you create an environment where businesses can thrive. Now, Africa should be coming to the table with donors as partners and say, look, donors, you can help you can help us connect us to the international markets. We have these goods that we can trade in your market. They need them. We need them. We need their money, they need our goods. So you are then creating now a situation where you can equally become a player on the global market. But also our African leaders need to focus more on things like capital markets. They need to look at things like remittances. We need to look at FDI, foreign direct investment, and say, look. And I think that's why China right now is becoming so popular in Africa. Am I saying that China is the solution? No, it is not.
Absolutely not.
Am I saying it doesn't have its own political agenda or its own geopolitical interests?
It sure does.
It sure does. But at least they are coming and they are presenting themselves as a business partner, And I think for me, that is where largely our governments need to look at. How do we have a big business environment? How do we nurture talent within our young people?
Recently, and just to juxtapose not a new idea, maybe just a rejoinder. I think there was a World Bank summit in Nairobi. President Museveni was giving a keynote. And his concept was, whenever he's looking for funding for key growth factors of the economy, either the funding for electricity or funding of railways or getting money to, let's say, for Uganda Development Bank to start to support micro SMEs and SMEs themselves, that money is not available. But money for programs which are spending a lot of time in hotels, programs which are not contributing to core driving factors of the economy, that money is not available. Or if it is available, it's available just at a very, very, very low scale. But maybe the second context, maybe as you still make a comment on that, is research was done, and the money which flows out of Africa in terms of the illicit financial flows, when you compare it with the aid which comes to Africa, the money which actually flows out of Africa from the continent, either in terms of raw minerals or in terms of just money going through legal but of course, illegal processes of either profit repatriation back to the other world. It's far more than the resources which are coming from the north to the south. So that kind of begs the question on who does this foreign aid infrastructure actually benefit, and why can't it reform to a level where the ordinary citizen is empowered to sustain themselves? They are given the skills that are needed themselves as citizens to ensure that they can thrive on their own. And I think that's quite important. I don't know what you think about those two very pieces of context.
One, I am reminded of and it's funny that I'm going to quote Bush when he said we must be careful of the soft bigotry that comes with low expectations. Joseph, such is our position as Africa today, that especially the elites don't have any hope in the current governments, because, and to quote, there are some countries that are really doing well towards moving away from that, but they're a small number. What we need is a massive wake-up call around the continent. To get back to that and speak to your question directly, the question is, do our leaders really, don't they see these things? I think they do. But I think one of the things that aid does is that it aids corruption. So then they're in a position where they know. So for example, look at the biggest corruption scandals. I remember when I was young, there was the, forgetting that, the...
Gavi.
You remember Gavi, the Gavi saga? Then there was also this saga that had our own member of parliament from Rukunjili, and Captain Mike Mukula.
Yeah.
Most of the big sagas, for example, in our country, but also go to Botswana, go to Ghana, go to Botswana, you'll find that most of the big corruption cases are always around foreign money. They are never around. It's so hard to find that the locally generated tax has been stolen. Most of the times there is this money. It was supposed to be doing some work around HIV. It was supposed to be doing some work around local governments. And it was from this and this country. It has been stolen. So what normally happens, Joseph, is that sometimes our governments are not blind. These are people who are educated, and they look through these contracts. They can also see that the ulterior motive is really...
Yeah, and they're like conditionalities. Yeah, you find there's like a very huge grant, but it's dependent on certain expatriates, by the who do work which Africans can do.
Yeah.
Coming on ground, some are tied to US contractors actually supplying,
exactly,
like Chinese. I think Uganda has farms which can implement...
Yeah, yes, sure, we do.
Yeah, but they come with conditionalities where it has to be the Chinese or it has to be an American company that is doing.
But for me, I don't blame them. I blame us, because they are looking
money anyway.
They are looking out for their interests. They have defined what their interests are, and they are working towards their interests. What are we working towards as Africa? If you come on a negotiation table and you have nothing to offer, then you can as well take whatever is given to you.
Whatever bond is thrown at you.
Exactly. So for me, it goes back. It's a question of leadership, Joseph. It's a question of leadership. I'm always heartbroken whenever I see the government remembering about foreign funding when it comes to young people speaking about their rights, when it comes to activists coming out to say, no, the government, this governance system needs to change. When the young people come out to say, no, this, we want accountability from our leaders on matters A, B, and C, then they become foreign agents. The government is the biggest foreign agent. Who gets these loans from IMF? Who gets, Joseph? Are you by the way aware that IMF and World Bank have offices in Bank of Uganda, in Uganda here?
We'll chase them like those of Kenya.
That's the offices are here within your World Bank, rather within your Bank of Uganda. The question is, what does that show you? Are you really a sovereign country? Are you really a sovereign country? It's a question of leadership, Joseph.
Yeah, and maybe before we can get to a closing statement, in Kenya recently, was it September thereabout, when the IMF, IMF you normally go to it when you have a problem. They rarely come to you, but I'm told that's just jargon in the Bretton Woods institution when they were requiring Kenya to raise their domestic revenue, and they through more taxes, and then Kenyans refuse that conditionality. I don't know what citizens can do, if to ensure they're also like part of the equation, such that they can either hold leaders to account on these decisions they are making on their behalf, because technically they are borrowing on your behalf. What can we do to ensure citizens are involved to stop this appetite for aid?
I think steps have been taken, and I think sometimes it is also very, very, very important that we recognize where we have made important strides. I think, for one, that civic awareness in Uganda is increasing, especially with the emergence of social media. And so is in Kenya, and so is in most parts of Africa today. With the world becoming increasingly interconnected on the internet, we are seeing young people take interest in the day-to-day matters, in the political matters of their countries. I'll give you an example that, for example, recently with the exhibitions that happened as early as 2024, the NGO exhibition, you remember, where some wrote in the civil society was exposed. You remember the parliament exhibition where leaders were brought to account. Was justice served? I may say not so, but at least were they exposed? Yes. And that is how civic awareness starts, that we can now all go on social media and whether disagree or agree, but at least we are disagreeing and agreeing on fundamental topics that drive our society. That we are having now a situation where people come on Twitter spaces and are largely talking about the budget, and this is a civic discussion. It's just civilians of the country speaking about their country. That we can now have people call their leaders to order. Whether they respond or not, it will just be on record that people did their part, you know.
Oh yeah, sure.
And for me, I think that is something very important. I think that's something we need to appreciate. I have always been amused, and I think I have constantly asked you this question, that the Musevenis of the time, the Lumumbas of the time, the Sankalas of that time had no social media. They never had a tool that would get them together the way social media can get us all together, you know. But the question is, how did they manage to pick interest in how their society is run? There is this whole notion that and sometimes you listen to even a young person say it and you're like, what is this? A young person tells you, I'm not interested in politics. But politics is you.
Is interested in you.
Politics is interested in you.
Fine.
You will have to eat, and that all is politics. So for me to see that young people are increasingly becoming interested in the conversations that drive and transform society, for me that is a big plus. I think more can still be done. I think we still have a role to play as civil society organizations, as civil actors, like activists, as Ugandan citizens, sure. African and East African citizens. There is so much we can still do, because I wanted to perhaps say this as my closing statement, but let me just say it. Africa is going under a PR crisis. Our story is being told by not us. You will go to social media and you will see very many memes, they call them, short clips of videos, and you will see poverty and then you will see people joking that this is how, say, BBC or CNN portrays African stories. But that's because we are not telling our story. We have quite a lot of amazing things in Africa here. We have a lot of good things that are happening. We have a lot of good things that are happening in line with our economics.
Food.
Yeah, So we need to come out and use social media. We need to come out and use whichever means we can use to paint the Africa also that we see. Because when the person comes and paints what will serve his or her interests, then we must also come out and say, okay, But also, I think Kenya has taught us a good lesson, and I think Kenya has been a case study that we must emulate. We can have a discussion on other means of how we can emulate Kenya without necessarily maybe using their means, but also their means are okay because it is within their constitutional rights, to protest if that's the language they choose. So for me, I think we also need to use Kenya and see, okay, how do we as citizens move away from always uniting around one citizen? I think in Kenya this time around there was no Raila Odinga leading the protest.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So how do we always get to that point? And it takes us back. I think Kenyans have done what the famous quote from David Mpanga, who said that we have not yet created that central nervous system to feel each other's pain. But I think Kenyans have. And I think that's why they were able to speak the same language.
Even now with abductions, I think they're doing a good job.
I think even with abductions, they are coming out. I think we have had more, perhaps, than they have had. But I think they have raised the voices more than us here.
For us, I don't know whether we got to some point of apathy. Maybe as you close, was a closing statement done? Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for coming to share your thoughts on Africa beyond foreign aid and how we can interrogate the effectiveness of this foreign policy instrument. To you, our viewer, we thank you for joining this podcast. Please feel free to subscribe to this very YouTube channel or Podbean channel if you are listening in on Podbean. We look forward to sharing more content on how Africa needs to be reshaped by its leaders or how African leaders are shaping their future using ideas and people. My name is Joseph. It was good to host you.
Thank you for listening to the Policy Digest, a Center for Policy Analysis podcast that explores how African societies are governed and how people and their leaders are shaping the future of their communities. For more podcasts, check out our Podbean and YouTube platforms. Thank you.